Hi everyone, and welcome to our first official video in the geometry branch transformations. We're discussing translations in today's lesson. Now before we jump into today's lesson, why don't we take a look at what we need to be familiar with. So the prior knowledge for today's lesson is going to help us because it forms that foundation we need. Today's lesson needs sound understanding of coordinate geometry. So we need to know about the coordinate plane, we need to know about the format of the coordinate plane, we need to know about locating points. So we need to know about referencing using coordinates. We need to know about basics of transformations, the names that you've been familiar with since primary school when you learned about transformations such as slides, flips and turns, because this is our basic understanding of transformations. And we also need to know about polygons, because we don't only look at translating and transforming points or lines, but we also look at translating and transforming different polygons such as triangles and quadrilaterals as the case may be. Once we're familiar with this information, we can get into today's lesson. Now let's take a look at the objectives for today's lesson. By the end of today, you should be able to define a translation. You also need to know the common name used to refer to translations and how to distinguish a translation from any other type of transformation. So once we get through today's session, these are the 3 key things you need to know about and you should be able to understand and explain. Now, why don't we take a look at some of the keywords we're going to be seeing in today's lesson. Transformation, as you know, this is the topic that we're discussing. Translation, which is the specific transformation that we're looking at. Slide, which is the name that you should be familiar with from primary school. Then we're going to learn about the object. We're going to learn about the image, location, size, shape, orientation, and congruent. So these are all keywords you're going to be finding in today's lesson, which will be highlighted. So let's jump straight into our lesson today. When we talk about translations, we talk about the simplest of all transformations. But what do we mean exactly when we talk about the translation? Well, why don't we take a look here at this particular image? Now look at the picture you see on the left of your screen. What do you notice about this image? What can you tell me is happening here? Well, take a very close look at it because we're going to be discussing this in a little bit. Now, I want you to observe. Although this is a still shot, you can tell that some action is taking place. Can you pinpoint what that action is? Well, let's see. We have water on a tarpaulin, and I guess you can say he's doing a makeshift water slide. So in other words, when he's playing on this makeshift water slide, he's sliding from one location to another. So when we talk about translations, that word slide should pop into your mind because you all would have met slides when you were in primary school and you dealt with transformations. You all learned about sliding objects. So when we talk about translations, you're going to be hearing the words sliding and slide very often because slide is another way to refer to a translation. Now, before we continue, I want you to take a look at this other image here. It's a little clip, and you can also see that a translation is taking place. But I want you to understand that it's not literally a slide as in our real world experience. It doesn't always have to be that way. Okay? Sometimes it could be running, as you would have noticed. He's running from one point to another, and then he slides from one point to another. Translations involve moving, which we said sliding, from one location to another. So this tells us that a translation refers to slides. That name that you've been using in primary school, a slide. So when we say a translation, what do we mean? We mean a slide. Now, let's take a closer look at the translation and try to understand what is actually happening in this particular transformation, because this will help us to distinguish a translation versus a reflection, a rotation, or even enlargements and dilations. Now here, I want you to take a look closely at this purple grid and notice that on this grid there are 2 points. We have the point labeled A and the point labeled B. Now, what if I told you that A and B represented a ball, where A represented the original location of the ball and B represented the location of the ball after I rolled it along the floor, which would represent our transformation of a translation. Now, A being the original location of the ball, this is the object. This is the point where it all started before I performed my translation. So the object will always refer to the shape or point before the transformation is performed, whereas the image will refer to that resultant shape after you've performed your transformation. So that's why B is labeled as the image. Now this brings us to defining the translation. Translation is the sliding of an object from one location to another. Now there are several types of transformations, and we need to be able to distinguish the translation from other transformations. So there are some important features I want to go through with you all, so you'll be able to distinguish the translation from all other transformations. Now let's take a look again at the purple grid with the 2 points A and B. We said that A is translated to point B, but can you tell what remains the same in this particular image? If you look carefully, you'll notice that there are certain features which remain the same. The first of these features is that the points are the same shape. Another feature which remains the same is the size of the points. When we notice that a shape remains the same size as well as it maintains its shape, we can say that through translating an object, the object and the image are congruent. Congruency means that the size and shape remain the same. When we translate an object, not just the size and shape remain the same, but there is also one other property which will still remain the same when we finish our translation, and that is the orientation, meaning the direction of the shape. Now it's not easy to see it with these 2 circles, but let's just say we were translating probably a quadrilateral such as a trapezium. It might be easier for us to see that the orientation actually stays the same. At the end of this session, we'll have a quick review exercise where you'll understand this concept of being able to observe the orientation remaining the same through a translation. Now, the reason for making sure that we understand that there are properties of this shape which remains the same under a translation, we also have to remember what really changes, and that is the location. Simply because a translation is a movement or a change in location, it moves from one point to another. So the location of our image will always differ from our object, and that's one of the reasons why we have the translation vector, which we will discuss in a later video. Now let's take a quick look at what we've learned today. We've learned quite a bit about translations. Now, what was the first thing we discussed? We talked about translation and defining it. We defined it as sliding an object from one location to another. We know that in a translation, there is an object as well as an image. So remember, these 2 terms in particular always apply to all transformations. When we speak about the object, always remember it is the shape before the translation occurs. In this case, because we're talking about translations, and the image will always be as a result of the translation. What else did we learn today? We learned about translating an object, and we know that when we translate an object, the object and its image are congruent, meaning the shape and size remain the same. We also know that its orientation will remain the same, meaning they face the same direction. Also, the location is the most important part of this translation because a translation simply means a movement from one location to another. Now, let's take a quick look at this little exercise, which is going to give you the opportunity to test your understanding of what we've discussed in this lesson. So, you can grab a pencil and paper, or you can just do this mentally. Let's begin. Here's our first exercise. Notice we have 4 statements. Now, you're going to choose the word, which will appear on your screen in a bit, which completes these sentences appropriately. Starting now. So were you able to complete all 4 statements with the correct word? Why don't we begin by looking at the first sentence? Here we have a translation that also holds a blank. What is a word you think would appropriately fill this sentence? Well, if you said the word slide, then you're right, because a translation is also called a slide. Now let's take a look at our second statement. Our second statement says that something is the shape before the translation is performed. If you can recall that the object is the shape before the translation is performed, excellent job. Why don't we take a look at our third statement? When we translate an object, the something changes. And you would have remembered, even from our summary, that we said there's one thing which changes about a shape, and that is its location. When we translate an object, the location changes. Now, our fourth and final statement. Under translation, the object and image have the same size and shape. This means that the object is something to its image. What can you say? Is that word going to be congruent? That's right. If a shape maintains its size and shape, then we can say that the shape is congruent. Have you gotten all 4 of these statements correct? Excellent job! Now let's prepare ourselves for yet another quiz, and this time it's on a more visual scale. So I want you to look carefully. We have a Cartesian plane coming into view, and we have some shapes. Notice that we have each triangle labeled A, B, C, and D. We're saying that A is our object which has undergone some translation. Can you identify which of these 3 other triangles just might correspond to the image of A? By now, you should be able to identify which triangle actually corresponds to the image of A under translation. And if you can see that the image is the triangle labeled D, excellent job. It's pretty obvious that D is the translated image of A because it is congruent since it has the same size and shape as well as orientation. C and B, however, don't correspond as being translated images simply because they're not in the same orientation, although they're the same size and shape. So that's why our answer had to be the triangle labeled D. Very good if you were able to identify D as the image of A under translation. And that brings us to the end of this lesson on translations. If you enjoyed this lesson and you're looking forward to learning a little bit more about translations, you can definitely look out for another video coming soon on how to translate objects in the coordinate plane.